Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have Jay Dyer back on the show. Jay, of course, is the host of Jay's Analysis, jaysanalysis.com. He also is the co-host of Hollywood Decoded. It's carried on the Gaia network. You can subscribe to that network and catch the shows. I believe that's the second season on that yet?
The metrics aren't in yet. It'll be a little while before they make a decision on that.
Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. And, of course, you are working on a sequel to Esoteric Hollywood, right?
Correct, yes. I'm about fourth of the way done.
Okay. So, Jay, how you doing?
Doing well. I'm glad I was snowed in for 8 days, so I was going crazy like that cabin fever movie. I was losing my mind, and like I said on Boiler Room, I was eating my toenails and chewing the skin off of my fingers.
Lucky you collect your toenail shavings, so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I make a necklace out of them. Do you remember that? Have you ever seen Universal Soldier?
Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah, the Dolph Lundgren character is a takeoff on the Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now.
Uh huh.
And he has a necklace of ears and thumbs.
That was with Kurt Russell, right? Am I right?
Universal Soldier is Jean-Claude and Dolph Lundgren.
Okay, because Kurt Russell made a movie like that too, didn't they?
Yeah, he did. I think it's just called Soldier.
Okay, that's why I'm confusing it. So.
Yeah, but Universal Soldier is about super soldiers. It's really dumb.
Yeah, it's
that program. Yeah.
So finally the thaw came in, and now you're able to go out and you're mobile again.
Yeah, 8 days that was pretty crazy. And it was 0, negative 10 degrees every day, so you couldn't really go walking. That's not much fun.
You live kind of a semi-rural area too, so. Right?
Yeah, I was trapped in an ice palace. It was like Peter in Narnia in the Witch in the Wardrobe when he's trapped in the palace by Jadis.
Well, at least your power stayed on and you had provisions, right? So
yeah, exactly, right.
So accentuate the positive there. So, well, tonight.
But we forget the weird thing is that it made me notice we forget about how close we are to mortality and nature.
Oh yeah. Because
we're so used to conveniences of modernity, and then after 7 days of being stuck inside a ice cube, you realize that, if the power went out, you could freeze.
Yes. Do you have a fireplace?
No.
Oh, yeah. So we have a fireplace, so if enough wood, so if something would happen, we can always do that. So. Well. We haven't had any weather like that up here yet. We've had some cold spells, but no meaningful, measurable precipitation or anything like that. So.
Well, actually, in that front, it got so cold that Tallahassee, which never gets super cold, Tallahassee was 19. That never happens.
It must have drove them nuts down there. That's insane.
Yeah.
19 degrees in Tallahassee. Jeez.
Right. And I don't ever remember it being -3 in Tennessee. I don't ever recall that in my lifetime.
Yeah, that's cold for Anchorage, Alaska in the wintertime.
Yeah.
So, wow. Well, tonight, you've done a number of talks. You're continuing this series, this globalist book series. And, with, I think this time you covered Bertrand Russell, Edward Bernays, Edward Lilly, the MK Ultra guy, the psychedelic guy, LSD guy.
John Lilly.
I'm sorry, Edward Lilly's the other guy. Yeah, John Lilly. Edward Lilly's the Catholic. And you had a number of talks, which is, I think, somewhat related. You talked about Western civilization and so-called shithole countries, and also this Davos, this World Economic Forum, this Davos meeting, and globalism. So you've covered a lot since I last talked to you. So what do you want to cover first? This globalist book series, these characters and how they're related. They kind of represent a certain class or at least a certain worldview of the elite. So how do you want to go into it?
Well, being stuck inside an ice cube is good for making videos. There's really nothing else to do. So you have books and videos, but
the viewers watch you go crazy. The viewers get the benefit of seeing you just descent into madness as each day goes by.
I think every video I put up, the commenters believe that I've descended further into madness. So standard fare, literally every time. So, but I think probably since we last talked, we've covered quite a few globalists. You and I did talk about Kessler and H.G. Wells and Jonas Salk. And then I did Charles Galton Darwin's genocide plan for the next million years. Isn't it interesting that we're told that we have to be concerned with empiricism and the immediate data and reason, and then when we read Charles Galton Darwin, one of the top figures of that Royal Society type clique, we get this wild, fantastical science fiction narrative of how there's going to be Eloi and Morlocks evolving in the next million years, which is all just ludicrous.
Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing next weekend. So, I mean, it's a bold prediction.
It's a very out there book, but setting aside the sci-fi LARPing, he does talk about a lot of the similar patterns that we saw in Russell and other big geostrategy planners. And one of those was right away he talked about attacking the food. So he goes after the importance of altering man through food. And this is another pattern throughout all of these characters that we've seen. Russell said you have to immediately get control of the resources and food. You have to get control of the food is what H.G. Wells said. Charles Galton Darwin says it. And I've read the sermons and different, I've read Sir Francis Galton and I've read Malthus, so I know where these people are coming from. And this, of course, would be one of the main differences I have with the alt-right. So hopefully I'll actually have a couple debates coming up with some fairly prominent alt-right people, and hopefully we'll get to debating some of these topics. But with Galton Darwin, you have this idea that evolution can be commandeered, and that's what we saw with Kessler. Kessler's whole program at the end of Ghost in the Machine was the commandeering of evolution by man. Russell says the same thing. So again, they're all saying the same thing, and so that right there shows you that there's actually a unified conspiracy. It's the open conspiracy, as we saw H.G. Wells describe it. So DNA, genetics, all of that, rather than actually being something that testifies to a creator and to order and to meaning, for these guys, it's all just something there for man to manipulate and turn to his advantage. And by doing what we mean by this is dysgenics. So this will play into the topics you mentioned in terms of shithole countries and so forth. And dysgenics is the active attempt to mess up the genetic structure and the progeny of some other group of people. So eugenics would be the intent to keep your lineage, your progeny, healthy, safe, secure, in some degree pure. And that can take on many different forms or different aspects. But a lot of people, and this is a real distinction, it's not me making this up, but a lot of people get confused with this because they assume, eugenics means that anything, the left will talk about eugenics a lot. This means anything to do with people group, ethnos, race, et cetera, et cetera. We don't want anything to do with that. And so therefore anything that talks about that is just, there equals eugenics. And that's just simply not true because, for one, I mean, we could talk about Babel and the story of Babel. We don't believe in Babel. We don't believe that there needs to be the destruction of distinctions between people groups. And that's essentially what was happening at Babel, was that it was the blending and the creation of the big blob, to worship Nimrod. And in our view, God divided the nations for a reason, in Genesis 10 and 11. So So we don't want to go back to Babel, and we necessarily then want to maintain these distinctions. So that will play into the Western shitholes and all that kind of stuff that I talked about in that video. But this, again, does relate to Charles Galton Darwin, because as we saw with the characters like Russell and others, Russell actually, when I got into Impact of Science on Society, which I haven't talked to you since I did that book, there were some really phenomenal statements that in many ways topped what he talked about in Scientific Outlook, because he actually says that I'm worried about Russia. I'm worried about that civilization being a challenge to our dysgenics, radical technocratic scheme that we want to put in place. And so we have to promote abortion. We have to promote, that's why he goes and meets with Lenin. So when you read V.I. Lenin, and when you hear Lenin talking about controlling resources and creating artificial scarcity, he's no different than Bertrand Russell. They might differ on a couple things, but by the end of Impact of Science on Society, you realize that the so-called Western elite liberals and the liberal imperium are just another costume, another mask of the same people putting into play the Soviet experiment. And isn't it interesting that Russell refers to the American experiment, the Soviet experiment, the socialist experiment? They're all experiments to see what's the best way to dominate man. And the irony of all this, and I know people will find this difficult to swallow, distasteful, is that the older forms of statecraft that have existed in Europe, that have existed in Russia, that have existed in Serbia, Romania, which would be monarchia, which would be the oikoumene, the ecumenical notion of the empire, the imperium, that gave man much more status, much more dignity, and man had many more rights and much more freedom. Yes, in an imperium and in a monarchy, men had much more freedom than they possess in the attempts to resurrect or create the purely rationalistic techno state. And that's really what the Soviet experiments were. And so that explains why David Rockefeller can write From a China Traveler in 1973 in the New York Times and say how awesome Mao was. That's why Bertrand Russell can say how awesome the Bolsheviks were. And why were the Bolsheviks awesome? Because they were stamping out Christian civilization.
Yeah, an interesting point there. I mean, you made that point about Bertrand Russell and targeting Russia as an adversary, a stumbling block to the globalist, agenda, is that he distinguishes the Bolsheviks from Russia, meaning that the Bolsheviks are agents of the West, of the Masonic West, to destroy Russia, because the traditional Russia is recognized as an adversary to the Anglo-American or Anglophile world, this Masonic world, and that's a lot of people don't make that distinction, because even today when they're talking about Russia, they say, well, they're just like the Soviets. Well, the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik regime, the Leninist regime, was imported from the West. And that's why Bertrand Russell would say, I just thought it was interesting that he distinguished the Soviet regime from Russia, whereas a lot of people in the West are still are unable to do that, or were unable to do that during the Cold War. They didn't see that dimension or that level of, I guess you could say, intrigue to the Cold War.
Yes, I was looking for a book. I don't see it, but it's Dr. Richard Spence, who I did an interview with a couple of years ago on his book on Crowley, who as an asset. His newest book, which I've read a little bit of, is intended to kind of be a sequel to the work of Anthony Sutton. So what he writes about in this new book is a more detailed analysis of exactly who was funding the Bolsheviks. And yes, many of them were atheistic Jews, and I think that they probably did have a vendetta against the Tsar and so forth. But it wasn't everybody Jew, and not everybody who supported them was Jew. So you have this confluence, this sort of agreement between a kind of vengeful I don't want to say Zionism because I don't know that they were necessarily Zionists yet, but the Jewish attitude towards, pogroms and the czars and so forth.
This is the Jacob Schiffs, Samuel Untermeyer's, these guys. Yeah.
And I've read Warburg's letters where he talks about supporting the Bolsheviks, so that's all true.
But if you were you're a member of the Round Table, the Inner Circle, and you have this ethnic group which has some considerable influence and now financial power in the West and New York and London. Mm-hmm. These are the people you would enlist in this project because they have a tangible ethnic animosity against Russia. So obviously they're going to be part of the plot and they're going to be very effective. So.
Right, exactly. And so, there's plenty of other interests that are involved in this. It's not just Jewish banking houses, and we covered that in depth in The Tragedy and Hope. Mm-hmm. But certainly in the background of the British financial elites, you do have Lord Rothschild. I mean, there's no question about that.
Yep.
I covered that extensively in the Anglo-American Establishment book talks that I did, those two. And then that came up in the Davos lecture because or the Davos interview and talk that I did. So anyway, what we have is different attitudes and angers that can be harnessed. So that's how, for example, we wouldn't say, oh, well, Mao's revolution in China was Jewish. I don't really think it was. I think that you had the OSS going and training Mao's guerrillas, and you had Western aid and support for Maoism. And then you have a few decades later, David Rockefeller saying how great Mao was and how great it was to set up Chase Bank in communist China. And that's how Walmart exists. It's because of this. Yes. I mean, this shows you that this is a scam, right? I mean, and I'm really I'm going to start going on the offensive actually and really starting to debate with a lot of the so-called capitalists and people that are really, because a lot of them love Walmart, and Walmart's a great example of something that was not Sam Walton pulling himself up by his bootstraps, but was something engineered with the aid of the Rockefellers. I mean,
it was the trilateralist plot in the mid '70s to bring China on board as this manufacturing
exactly.
giant. At the same time, they're playing games with the currency, with the Yom Kippur War, the creation of the petrodollar. This is going to have long-standing effects on the U.S. economy because as the dollar is enthroned as the world reserve currency because of the petrodollar, it's going to create the macro effect here in the United States. It's going to subsidize imports and make exports more expensive. That's going to lead to the deindustrialization of the United States, which fits this trilateralist agenda. At the same time, something like Walmart, you've heard connections of Walmart and also Tyson's Food to Mena, Arkansas, and the cocaine and all that.
Exactly.
It's not this clean-cut market process going on here. It gets really interesting. To say that.
Well, Russell says in Scientific Outlook, I tweeted this out, got like 500 shares and likes. Russell says here that back in 1931 that the West would be deindustrialized and it would move to China.
Yeah.
He said that in 1931.
1931. Well, if they're writing books like the next million years, writing 75, 80 years later is but yeah, I mean, you've made the point even with China. Was it Sun Yat-sen was a Mason, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That I don't think Quigley hints at the weird intermarriages that Sun Yat-sen had, and then I dug up in separate sources. Off the top of my head, I don't recall, but yeah, he was a Freemason. And absolutely, when we look at the history of Freemasonry, I mean, they've had it in their rituals for a long time to get rid of throne and altar. Mm-hmm. So it's an anti-Christian movement, absolutely. There's no question about it. And in fact, and maybe in the future, we can talk about this, but I'm looking and thinking more lately about the Frankish thesis. Have you heard of this?
No, what is that? I might have just made by that name. Let's hear it.
This is an older Orthodox historical theory about what happened in the history of the West, particularly around 10,000 or 1000 AD, and a little bit before and a little after, and it kind of explains why we have the rise of Charlemagne in the Holy Roman Empire, and that this could have potentially been a source of problem, or a source not just of political state problems, but also maybe hermetic issues. And that if you read Hoffman's new book, Occult Renaissance Church of Rome, he focuses a lot on Florence and the Renaissance Hermeticists. And what I'm getting at is that there's a book called Romanity, and Father Romanides has a book on this, who I have a love-hate relationship with. But my friend James Kelly has also written a book on this, Anatomizing Divinity, and we did a couple interviews on this maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But the reason I'm thinking that this might be more relevant is that it's not I'm starting to kind of put a few more puzzle pieces together in this older history narrative, where I think that you kind of have these two important periods where you have the rise of the Medicis, and I think Hoffman convincingly demonstrates that is the basis for the influx of Hermeticism into the Roman Catholic Church in the Renaissance period,
and hence usury, right?
And hence usury, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's where that goes, and as we know, sodomy, usury always go together. Dante said this.
I've heard. What's that group in and around France? What do they call it? They were Hindu. They were commercial banking. I guess they were Jewish, but they were into like international trade and commerce. The
Black Nobility, Venice.
Oh, no, I forget what it was mentioned to me. I think Michael Hoffman might have mentioned it, but I think it might factor into this Frankish theory, because it's injection of the justification for commerce, which of course we see in the English world with the Newtonian world, right? This sort of.
That's where I was going to go with it. Yeah.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, no, it's okay, because but yeah, somebody should, I think, probably look into the parallel between the Frankish thesis and the rise of the Carolingian dynasty, and then what you have in the Florentines and what you have in the Medicis and a lot of those Renaissance characters. I think there would be a lot to figure out there. But anyway, the reason that the Frankish thesis is relevant is because it does come at the time. Well, what I'm saying is that the changes in the Western Church happen at a time when you have the anointing of a new emperor. So and I don't think this is debated by anybody, Orthodox or Roman Catholic, but in 800 you have the Pope anointing a new emperor for the West, and this was seen as bizarre because there already was an Orthodox imperium. So if you think about church history, you have Old Rome and New Rome. New Rome being Constantinople, Old Rome being where the emperor previously lived, and then he moved to Constantinople. And the significance of Old Rome really only retained its luster because of the Roman bishop. And then you have Constantinople taking on a primacy, not just because of the Bishop of Constantinople, the Patriarchate, but also because of the Imperium. This is, of course, during Constantine, right? So for the period of the ecumenical councils of the church, right, from 325 Nicaea and then all the way up to the 7th/8th council in the 9th century in the universal church, right, for the first millennium, you have the recognition of there being one imperium. And that's why the councils are called ecumenical. In oikumene means the extent of the empire, the imperium. And then because of the sack of Rome by the Vandals, the Goths, you have the loss of the political power in 400 in the West. So the papacy takes on naturally a kind of a more important role. This is where you get the rise of the papal states. Right? Mm-hmm. So, and I'm not faulting, I'm just saying that it was kind of natural given the geopolitical situation at the time. So by about 800, that's why it seems strange to the East that there would be the anointing of a new emperor in the West. Why do we need two emperors? We already have, a recognized imperium. Old Rome has already recognized the Orthodox imperium. But the reason is that there was already beginning to be a theological divide at that mm-hmm. time. So what you have then over the next few centuries is the rise of the Franks and the Carolinians. And if we wanted to have a little bit of conspiracy spice, probably has some relevance to Merovingians. But I don't think that the Merovingians are related to fish gods. I don't believe that the Priory of Zion is real. I think that's a completely fake conspiracy theory. But anyway, but there is a noticeable change in praxis in the church in the West at this time, where you have, again, not debated, but you do have the addition of the filioque to the creed at this time by the Carolinians. The Frankish missionaries are the first to do it in Orthodox areas. I'm saying in Romania, and then you also have the switch to using exclusively statuary in the West, which is an interesting development. Some people have argued that that's related to Platonism. James Kelly has an interesting argument to that effect. And then you have the split between the East and the West, obviously, in 1054. So you have two divergent tracks that the East and the West took. And what I find interesting, and again, I'm not saying that this is necessarily a big proof of anything. I'm just piecing together, pretty complex topics, is that what we see is a model of church and state that kind of stays the same in the East. And when you read the decrees of the ecumenical councils and the way that they speak of the emperor, the Orthodox emperor, the imperium and all that, it's very difficult for me to understand why we would have to have a completely different church-state relationship develop, after 800 AD. In the West, and that's naturally what happens in the West. So I don't think anybody debates that there's a different conception, of church and state between the East and the West. So in other words, what a lot of times is accused of the East is Caesaro-papism, or the idea mm-hmm. that Caesar is the Pope. We would just simply say that the opposite is true of the West, is papalo-Caesarism, that the Pope takes on a role of worldly emperor that was never intended or acted upon in any way like that for the first millennium of the church. Ratzinger writes this way in his book, Introduction to Christianity, where he says that for the first millennium of the church, it was conciliar, it wasn't a papal monarchy, and that really it was over time in the West, in the second millennium, that this came to fruition. Why? I mean, anyway, I know you probably don't want to debate papal infallibility, but what I'm saying is I think we get two different conceptions of not just man, not just anthropology, not just the meaning of the world, but also church and state. So different conceptions of church and state in the East and the West naturally lead to different social interactions and relations between nations, cultures, et cetera, et cetera. The vision of the Orthodox view during the Imperium and then later into post-fall of Byzantium in 1493, you get the church sort of being under the dominance of Islam in the East and having to put up with caliphates and so forth, except in Russia. So you do have the continued acceptance in Russia, in Serbia, Romania, right, of these Orthodox Christian monarchs who protect the church. So for me, it's just fascinating that I think that just contained in the symbol of the double-headed eagle, which is not a Masonic symbol, it's not a Scottish Rite symbol, it's an ancient Orthodox symbol of the symphonia between church and state for the first millennium of the church. It goes back to Byzantium. So it has nothing to do with Scottish Rite 1700s Freemasonry that was appropriated by them. But that's clearly what you see continuing into to Russia, for example, into Serbia. And in many of these nations, their flags. We have these traditional images on the flags of these countries. So, so the vision of this idea is that there is a harmony between the one and the many, ideally. Yes, there will always be people arguing and fighting. That's unavoidable. But we strive for a harmony between Christian nations and peoples on the basis of the faith first and foremost. But then the different nations and peoples retain who they are. And we can see this in different ways, as evident in the fact that you have historic liturgies that use most of the time cultural expressions of language or national traditions Armenia, we would say, is in schism. But when Armenia was originally Christianized, it was the church in Armenia. It was the church in Georgia. It was the church in wherever, Ephesus, which is, well, that's modern day Turkey. But what I'm saying is that for the first millennium of the church, the conception is that the national churches meet together and are unified under the banner not of a patriarch of Constantinople as the emperor, not under solely one supreme monarchical bishop, but under the college of the bishops at the ecumenical councils, all of which were called by the emperor. So I think that the fact that the emperor called all those councils, I think that's a testament to a different conception of church and state, and that the bishops from these different countries represent the people groups. And the fact that they maintain and continue their linguistic traditions through things like the liturgy. To me, that says that the intention of God is not to get rid of nations, to blend everything into a Babel, but to maintain distinctions, and that we can have unity in the midst of distinction. So, and I know I'm rambling, but I'll make one more point on this. A lot of times when you discuss this, people immediately sort of get triggered and they go into freak out mode. And if they have some kind of biblical or Christian type perspective, they'll retreat into something like Galatians, where Paul says, in Christ there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. And quite simply, that is the stupidest argument for why there should not be ethnic distinctions anymore between peoples, precisely because if that is the argument you're making, then it also means that there's no gender anymore, that there should not be gender distinctions, and that there should not be class distinctions. So basically it lends to some sort of social justice warrior communist type perspective, yeah. Which I don't think most Christians want to go in that direction. But for us, that does not mean that nationhood or that the idea of the ethnos is ever above or that it ever transcends in some mystical way the faith. So for us, the faith itself is first and foremost, should be. And that's why, for example, we can't ever accept things like Teutonic, Aryan paganism, Nazism. Those things are unacceptable. There's some great articles at Soul of the East by Ivan Ilyin, the Russian philosopher, rebuking sort of Aryan paganism, precisely because it's a return to a kind of biological worship, a worship of biologicization of man, not recognizing that man is more than merely biology. But at the same time, we can also recognize a distinction in cultures. I mean, this should be common sense. All of our forefathers before 1960 thought this way. There was obviously a distinction between cultures. I was just thinking about how Jesus himself has no problem in the Gospels castigating one city as completely corrupt and degenerate. Capernaum, he says, right? How do you think you will escape the gates of hell? Rather, you will be pulled down to Hades, he says. He says, you're worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. So in other words, Jesus is not a cultural relativist. He has no problem, castigating certain places, regions as being exceedingly wicked. This should be common sense, biblically speaking. So there shouldn't be this egalitarian presupposition on the part of anybody who, takes historic Christianity seriously, to try to think that, because Jesus came, this suddenly means that we're all supposed to be completely equal. That's just simply not true. Number one, because in our physical being, we're obviously not completely equal. Males and females are biologically absolutely distinct in their chromosomes from birth, right? I mean, we are different and distinct in our gifts and our talents and our abilities. So all of this should really be common sense. And it's funny, I was just reading through Proverbs, and I was just kind of taken aback at how I was, back when I was a Protestant, I would read Proverbs all the time, and it didn't even occur to me how many times in Proverbs you have discussion of what it is to be aristocratic, what it is to be noble. In my translation, I'm sure, it's a different translation, but the same idea is there. What it is to respect the king and to respect authority. All these principles are biblical. And a lot of times, how can that be true? Because the Israelites wanted a king, and right, and God castigates Israel for one. And actually, when you read that, they're not castigated because they wanted a monarchy. They're castigated because they wanted a monarchy like the pagan nations around them, so that they could basically fall into a kind of king worship, which is what happens in the books of Kings. Mm-hmm. But when you go back to Genesis 49, one of the earliest messianic prophecies is that the scepter will not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. That's always been seen as a messianic prophecy. The scepter being the royal lineage, the Davidic line, is already being predicted there in Genesis 49, and it won't depart until Messiah comes. And what happened when the Messiah came in 70 AD? The temple and the monarchy were destroyed in Israel by the Romans. So that's actually, I think, a very strong proof of not just Christianity, but also, the general testament in the history of the biblical presentation towards monarchy, towards hierarchy. And that's why the church and the nations that the church Christianized for the first millennium, and even still today, roughly, this form of government is what just became the norm. So, there's no republicanism or Sovietism in the Bible. And I was listening to some trad podcasts and some alt podcasts and shows very recently, and they were holding up people like Julius Evola and saying, here we go, here's the model. And I'm sitting here thinking, Julius Evola promotes Crowleyan butt sex. So I'm gonna hold up this as the model, the Orthodox Study Bible. And I'm gonna say that a better model would be not just a rank sort of pagan worship of will to power and butt sex, but actually, this is what happens, by the way, in Kings. Actually turn to male prostitutes in the books of the Kings under Jeroboam, when the Samaritan religion is set up. So they were falling into the same problems then. But anyway, my point is just that I think we get two rival conceptions of what it is to retain your identity between East and West ultimately. And I'm not being unfair to Catholics here. I'm speaking more so of the West in general, how it now has fallen into a completely Tower of Babel perspective where they want to try to force everybody into a monoculture and destruction of genetic distinctions. I think that's by design. You have countless globalists who write about it being by design. It's not hard to figure that out. But when it comes to the Roman Catholic Church, I think it's very unfortunate that, the more recent statements of the papacy have basically been in line with this kind of globalism of, don't have borders, let the wall, of course the Vatican has big ass borders around it, giant walls and guards, but we shouldn't have borders and so forth. And that's just because we've become so immersed in cultural relativism, and that we're bad and we should feel bad, because white people extended, themselves across the globe. We're supposed to feel bad for that. But, that's really a hypocritical, there's no moral high ground by the people who try to take that, because they don't actually have any moral high ground. Number one, because they're moral and cultural relativists. So how are they going to say that it's wrong in it at all? They may not like it, but they don't have a basis for saying it's wrong. But anyway, I'm sorry, I've gone crazy here with this coffee I've been drinking. Ramble.
Well, yeah, on what basis would, say, someone of Aztec lineage condemn the West?
This reminds me of exactly a great thing that came up in philosophy classes in college would be two things: female circumcision and Aztecs. Mm-hmm. This always came up, and I would actually bring it up quite a bit because, you have the feminist professor who's like literally sweating, what do you do? Because female circumcision, if you say it's wrong, then you're basically saying that culture is practicing something that you think is objectively, morally inappropriate or, quote, wrong.
No, they get more outraged over a perceived wage gap than do over female circumcision.
That's a great point. Yeah, I mean, bat an eye at Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah. It's because it's about, again, there's no moral or philosophical, logical consistency here. It's all about whatever argument serves your purpose at the time. Will to power, intimidation, and these things. So trying to get a rational argument from these types of people is a fruitless endeavor, because that's not what they're there to do. They're there just to use rhetoric and language, ambiguous language. I was reading Billington's Fire in the Minds of Men. He's talking about revolutionary language. It was inherently ambiguous for a reason.
Yes.
You don't want to be pinned down to anything. You just want to make these stupendous. It's like bumper sticker philosophy, right? It's or now it's like what you might put on a tweet or something. There's no.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, the is part of the destruction of the language and
hashtag me too.
Removing of nuance, and it's mindless.
Mindless. But yeah, I mean, it's a great point. How these divisions within the church and the right after the first millennium have these long-term consequences. And one, the gradual, infiltration of the Western church by elements, but I guess as a development, even free Masonic elements. You have, I had a recent interview with David Wemhoff in his book. He takes on these issues. He's written a couple articles on ethnicity and the importance of ethnicity, actually. I was reading it just today, an article on his website, The American Proposition, about ethnicity, about America. How there's no America, there's no nation, America. United States has no ethnicity to it. Right, it's this propositional nation, and then therein lies so many of its problems. The church today has embraced Americanism, and this is part of this doctrinal warfare that was waged right after the Second World War with people like Peter Grace and Edward Lilly. They wrote up this part of the Psychological Strategy Board, the doctrinal warfare that they were targeting all the churches, but the Catholic Church proved to be a particular target because it was at that time considered an adversary. Catholic doctrine was considered a problem by the power elite in the United States, but also as a potential asset because of its worldwide reach. Its offices could be infiltrated, and the office of the papacy itself, having so much power, becomes a target. And this might be an argument for more of a conciliar establishment, where you don't have one target, because of various intrigues in the 1960s and Vatican II and these things, the efforts of Henry Luce and his and the American press, Time Life Empire, they controlled the interpretation of Vatican II, which more or less determined how people would see Vatican II, and from that they were able to infiltrate the church and get things like indignitatis humanae, this idea of religious freedom, and fundamentally changing, although Catholic doctrine wasn't changed, it fundamentally changed understanding Catholic doctrine, which is essentially the same thing from a practical perspective, how it's being carried out. And this notion of a confessional state being primitive, outmoded, this was the work of John Courtney Murray, saying that the confessional state was relevant for a certain time in history, now it no longer is, and the American system is the ideal system, and that's what should be embraced by the church, and the idea of religious freedom and these things is all part of human dignity. And when I was talking to David Wemhoff, I made the point that America, the United States, isn't a Catholic nation. It's not a nation per se. It was supposed to be very decentralized with various states. It was a confederation of states. But be that as it may, Okay, the United States is a Masonic Republic. It is what it is. But there were other countries that were confessional, were historically Catholic, like Spain, Italy, and Portugal. And those countries were targeted by the West to destroy the confessional state. And once the confessional state was destroyed in those countries and liberalism was imported, pretty soon you had this sort of this dramatic decline in not only the culture and the economies of those countries, like Spain, Italy, and Portugal, where they're no longer, their birth rates are below replacement rate. Hardly anyone's going to church anymore. They're bringing in all the radical, perverted ideas of the West, like gay, sexual revolution, gay liberation, and these things. So there you have it. The proof is in the pudding. And I said this. So and throughout the Cold War, particularly after 1960s, after Vatican II, the Franco regime was ridiculed as being a dictatorial, being illiberal, and in 1978 when they adopted the Western Constitution. After I think Franco died in 1975, they finally adopted a Western liberal constitution. Spain became a typical, Masonic republic with all the inherent problems.
Yeah, abortion, gay rights, all that. Right.
They had a gay pride parade just this past year in Spain during a Christmas celebration, the Three Kings parade, which is a Catholic celebration. And the same problems afflict Italy and Portugal, these historically confessional states. But there is a concerted effort to destroy these states. So what they're saying is these states cannot be tolerated.
Yeah, I mean, this has always been the plan of the infernal powers, because they knew that once that they could remove the idea of a Christian state, they could easily try to stamp out the church, or co-opt it. This is where you get the theory of the Alta Vendita, which is the document that purports to show one of the Masonic plans to try to capture the office of the papacy. Mm-hmm. John Benari puts that out. I don't know if it's still in print, but yeah, I mean, the Alta Vendita shows, straight from the lodge, basically the Grand Orient Lodge trying to argue that rather than being naive and thinking that the papacy could be destroyed, as many of the revolutionaries thought, why not just turn it into an agent of change? I think that it's pretty obvious that that's what's going on. And when you read a lot of these books, you start to see that, you have Malachi Martin even talking about the grand design. He says that John Paul II wasn't interested in eternal realities, but in geopolitical strategies for the grand design. Now, Malachi Martin is a dubious character and, mm-hmm. Worked for probably B'nai B'rith or something to that effect. So I don't trust him, but the fact that he's great friends with Paul VI and John Paul II tells you everything right there. They say, these are my great buddies. And look how great I am in helping to get these changes through under Cardinal Bay at Vatican II. So I would say that when it comes to Vatican II, most educated traditional Catholics know that it's not just Vatican II that's the problem. We actually had many years and maybe even a century or two of movements and ideas of change in the Roman Catholic Church that the papacy and these entities publicly at least opposed, over and over since the 1700s with the anti-Masonic encyclicals since then. But of course, Hoffman does make a great point that why did none of these popes call out usury? Isn't it interesting that the acceptance of through casuistry of cases where a usury can be done? And I think that that's probably directly connected to the Rothschilds being the papal bankers. This is what we get into when we focus on geopolitical concerns ahead of, theological concerns. And that's really, I think, what happened in this situation, and why bureaucracy really becomes the new god. So anyway. Yeah.
A modern example, that would be the, Roberta Calvary, the Vatican Bank, and Branco Ambrosia, and how the Vatican was embroiled in this drug-running mafia, CIA drug-running operation in order to funnel funds to solidarity, right? And again, worrying about geopolitics, obsessing on geopolitics, and I guess forgetting doctrinal purity, and also even to ultimately its pastoral duties, you know.
Yeah, I mean, John Paul's hanging out with William Colby. He's not hanging out with, Saint Basil.
Or the other.
He's not reading Saint Basil. He's reading William Colby's intelligence report.
And the other, what's his name? The other Catholic CIA, CIA, what was his name in the 80s? Casey.
Marcin?
Casey.
Oh, William Casey.
William Casey, yeah, who was, some of the things he's been tied to. But, it's interesting. I was, Pope Francis, I think it was the last.
Am I right? Oh, wait, am I getting Casey and Colby? Is it, I thought it was, Colby came up with the Templars and met with John Paul, wasn't it?
Well, Colby was Catholic. He's a director of Central Intelligence in the 70s. Right. And then Casey was a Catholic member of the Knights Templar in the 80s. And he was involved, of course, a lot of intrigues and, Iran-Contra and
right. Okay.
That, and among other things. In just this last spring, Pope Francis, I think in the magazine La Croix, in a response to a question posed in an interview about separation of church and state, and Pope Francis said, "States must be secular. Confessional states end badly. That goes against it goes against the grain of history," he said. From what I understand, this is a contradiction of Catholic doctrine about the state.
Yeah, there's no question. Right.
Yeah, historically, the state called for a confessional state where the church was given privilege. Now, if you're not a Catholic or whatever, okay, you don't agree with that. But I'm saying, just from a Catholic standpoint, the ideal state would be a confessional state, recognizing the church as the church, and then allowing for religious free religious practice with some reasonable restrictions, because they want to, protect the country from being led astray. Because this comes from the doctrine of saying that error has no right. There's no right. And I guess from the liberal standpoint, this is perceived as being illiberal because we're all individuals and we're supposed to make these choices ourselves. But this goes to the root of the question about.
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole idea of liberalism is that it's relativistic. There is no such thing as authority because there's no transcendent. Whether every liberal realizes that or recognizes that is irrelevant, because that's the system that they're proposing. So, they may believe on the one hand that there is a God and that there is absolute truth. And then when they try to also be a relativistic, democratic, liberal, quote unquote, those two systems are completely incompatible. If your conception of God is anything connected to historic Christianity, because, look, this is not even debatable. There's no question to this. We already have, ancient, the Code of Justinian is a Christianized, imperium. It's an orthodox Christian imperium that stipulates all kinds of things on the basis of not just good principles in common sense and Roman law, but also from Scripture. So, and the Church Fathers and the canon law and so forth. All of it goes into play in something like the Code of Justinian, or the Institutes of Justinian, as it might be titled. And that would be normative in the imperium. So in other words, there's no debating this. It's already known. It's been known and practiced for hundreds of years once the empire was Christianized. In the East, Constantine is basically conceived of as next to the apostles. We don't literally call him an apostle. It's just a title of honor. But because of Constantine and his successors, the Orthodox emperor actually had the right to go behind the iconostasis, something that was only accorded to priests generally in the Orthodox tradition in the East. But because of the power and because we saw the emperor as a version of divine justice reflected on earth, for the East, it's just absolutely inconceivable. And that's why when I was doing the Tragedy and Hope lectures, I emphasized so strongly the fact that Quigley was right when he was saying early on in the book that the wars of the 20th century or to destroy these ideas, to destroy the idea of authority, to destroy the idea of imperium, to destroy the idea of transcendent hierarchy, and to replace it with the inversion: democracy, freedom, liberalism, equality, all the Masonic dictums that we've been force-fed our whole lives, which are just not true.
Yeah, so someone might be listening to this and saying we're advocating monarchy and hierarchy and church, privileged established church, and these things are illiberal, and they make demands upon the individual to support and respect, and also lends basically agree to be governed by these institutions in one degree or another. And this is illiberal because we should be able to make these decisions ourselves. Every man is a king. These things, and we should not be subjected to arbitrary rule of a bishop or a king, because it's all arbitrary, because this claim of having some sort of divine right or claim on the throne is all fake anyway. And man will be free when the last king is strangled by the intestines of the last priest, is
that Voltaire or Diderot?
Is something like that, yeah. Which it's great rhetoric again, but let's think about this, okay? But your claims about Masonic republics and democracy, I can hear it in your voice, is the confessional state can be illiberal. It can at times appear to be arbitrary, I guess. It can there's certain restrictions on your liberties in such a country, such a state. But let's not give the governments in the West a free pass. I mean, there's claims, the claim of us being free and us having the representative government and constitutions. That's a false claim, because the government doesn't follow the Constitution. Mm-hmm. The courts are there to come up with arguments to avoid the Constitution, to shred it when it suits the purposes of the government or the oligarchs. We have bureaucracies. Look at the bureaucracies in the West now, for Pete's sake. Look at taxation. Look at government spending. Look at the public debt. Look at the wars. Look at conscription. We're not free in the West. So we're less free under democracy. We're less free under constitutions. And I think you've made this point in the past with even Hans Hermann Hoppe, the libertarian. From a libertarian perspective, democratic republics and constitutions are a bad deal if you just look at the numbers, because government spending under democratic republics is 10 times more than it ever was under divine monarchies, under traditional confessional states. So from a liberal standpoint, it's a bad deal.
Right. Right, because it's things that are contrary to nature. Nature is hierarchical. Things that are contrary to nature don't work. Mm-hmm. But sometimes they're intended to not work. That's the point of democracy, because it's always been a tool of moneyed oligarchy. And moneyed oligarchy doesn't want prosperity. It doesn't want things to actually get better, or for there to be invention and creativity and the arts and freedom. Democracy, by its very nature, has to constantly subvert and constantly invert and constantly focus on the base, because its whole principle is the baser desires of man and how to control it, because that's how you create the lowest common denominator.